These days, I'm finding it harder and harder to not slide completely from outright skepticism to cynicism, particularly regarding the more monetary aspects of our current contemporary magical world. This is not a new problem by any stretch of the imagination. Those who, like myself, that have made it a life's work and a life's interest into looking at the history of magic, specifically the Western ritual magic continuum. We know that for as long as there has been people practicing and engaging in ritual, that there have been people that have been using this belief in magic to be grifters, to try and use this belief to separate some of the less skeptical and more gullible people within a society from their money. Belief is an interesting, wondrous thing, but it can also lead people into being taken advantage of. I'm not telling any of you anything that you don't already know. No doubt you know the argument coming from most folks living here in the West these days that all magic is fake. This is not real stuff. And anybody that engages in magic, particularly asking people for money in some way for either services or doing readings or anything, energy healings online, anything, that it's all just people trying to hustle you. We're all here. Us believers in magic, we're all here to just try and make money off of this stuff. We know it's not real, but we know that you think it's real, and the only reason we're doing this is because we're doing it to get your money. In fact, some would even say, like, those of us that are doing this, we're the deluded ones. It's just that we think it's real, and we think that what we're doing is real, and you think it's real, and there's money exchanged, and it's a sad situation. This is, again, the return of the demon-haunted world. Woe betide us! We live once more in a demon-haunted world. The bright lantern of rationality, logic, and enlightenment still have dark, ignorant corners in which they have not illuminated. Right? That's what we're dealing with mostly. And indeed, some might also say that the fact that some of us truly believe this kind of thing to our marrow, to the core of our being, that we, by believing this, could be, at best, highly deluded, but probably at worst, at least in some way, mentally ill. That we're probably crazy. We're probably cuckoo bananas. All of this is to say, it's easy to be skeptical about the occult and magic from the outside. It's very easy. It's perhaps a touch harder to be skeptical about this kind of stuff from the inside. Those of us that, again, believe this kind of thing to our core, that magic is an integral part of our being, and that some aspect of it, strangely enough, occults us into disbelieving certain aspects of what we are told how this world works. And by that very token, we are more susceptible to believing a lot of ideas that seem fringe and out there. And in general, we just are believers. We like to believe what we believe as long as they somehow fit into our reality tunnel. This is not restricted to, people that are already gullible and dumb. And this willingness to believe in the other and the hidden and the occult and the magic renders even the brightest of occultists to a susceptibility of not being able to properly engage in critical thinking and general skepticism. And yet, there is much to be skeptical about in this day and age. No doubt, if you are on any kind of social media platform, it seems like everyone in some way is offering their services to help you out in some way magically. Earlier, I would be like, this is a good thing. This is a good thing because magic is real and I see a lot of people engaging in magic. Therefore, this is a fantastic thing. Power to us, all the power to us. We're doing good. But I don't know anymore. I don't know. It's hard for me not to slide from that initial skepticism into complete cynicism about our current situation. Not everybody who's engaging in this stuff are actually doing magic. I'll bet quite a few of them are doing it for other reasons. One of them very well might be because they are a complete grifter. And in other regards, sometimes it's just a way for certain individuals to feel something, anything. But in most cases, it usually comes down to power over one or many people. The need for people to believe in this invisible world, in this other magical world, and to also, at the same time, be skeptical about it is a need, I think, in this day and age, to be of utmost importance. Also of importance could possibly be that one or many of these individuals to perhaps in a way be able to provide examples somehow for people to see what seemingly good, actual, huge air quotes there, actual Western ritual magic is and can be, the things that it is capable of, and particularly also what it is incapable of. Well, such a thing would be extremely helpful, I think, particularly right now. Again, right now being, in my opinion, the greatest period of time to be alive for ritual magic. You know, what if somebody or a group of people were to compile a lot of the more outlandish aspects of what is passing for magic these days, particularly through something like social media, and just showed how ridiculous a lot of it seems, not only to folks outside of the belief in magic, but to those of us inside. Surely this is accomplishable. Surely this is something that we could do. Surely such a thing wouldn't be used for other purposes. Well, something like this has occurred in the past. It was a work that was produced out of a personal skepticism, but also out of some kind of altruistic spiritual community service, because they themselves were living in a period of time in which magic was all around them. It was like today, seemingly everywhere. And this instance of the past, this work which was produced out of an initial skepticism from somebody who also believed in an unseen world, produced perhaps one of the most important books for the Western ritual magic continuum, but also a work which touched quite a few other realms as well. There are some books that, if you are like me, that you are interested in magic, that you absolutely 100% need to know a lot about, you had better believe this is one of them. My name is Douglas Batchelor, and you are listening to What Magic Is This Podcast, a podcast about magic, the occult, the esoteric, the paranormal, the supernatural, and the weird. It is time to examine the timeless, and that would be Reginald Scot's The Discovery of Witchcraft. One of the things that happens, and no doubt this has happened to some of you, is that when people find out or you tell people that you were a magician, the first thing that people will think you are is an illusionist or a stage conjurer. They'll be like, "Oh, I love magic tricks. Show me a magic trick. Like I can make a coin fall up from the sky or something like that." And you're just like, "No, that's not what I do. I do other kinds of magic. I mean, I could try. Might take some time, but that's kind of not. That's a thing." And what I do is something that's different. And then they'll be like, well, that thing that you do isn't real. The stuff that other people do, the stage magicians, what they do is a trick that is it's a real trick. What you do is a fake trick. Your trick, whatever you think you're doing, isn't real. And then inevitably, not every time, but a lot of the time, they'll use what knowledge they have of whatever stage magician that they have, and there's usually, a couple of them, literally a couple of them, and they'll use that as an example as to how what I do is not real. And they'll say, well, there's stage magicians like Penn and Teller, and they all say, every single one of them say that what you're doing is fake, that there's no such thing as magic, and there's no such thing as psychic abilities. Stage magicians don't believe in your kind of magic. And that's actually not true. There's a lot of very public, people like Penn and Teller, very public magicians that are skeptical of magic and don't think it's real, as well as a number of members of SciCop, which is the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, that were registered stage magicians and illusionists that say that magic is not real. But in general, when we have done actual polls, like actual polling, the truth seems to be the exact opposite. There's one poll I can think of wherein they polled a group of magicians in California, thousands of them, and they found that 82% of them believed in psychic ability, that we definitely don't know the full picture, and that there's something odd and there's something paranormal that is in the world. And if that's not enough for you, one of the most educated and scientifically minded countries on Earth right now, Germany, they did a poll back in the early aughts, and they found 72% of the stage magician and conjurers and illusionists there said that psychic abilities are quote-unquote probably real. Skepticism is not a thing, and it's weird because people come at it from all kinds of different angles, and a lot of times what you will find is that there's usually a story before the skepticism. I mean, I know it sounds obvious, but nothing comes out of a vacuum, right? And scathing criticism as well as skepticism, there's always a motive behind them. Sometimes obvious, sometimes not so obvious. Keep this in your mind as we move forward in this show. And one of the major reasons, in fact, the reason that I started this episode off after the intro with talking about stage magic is because the work that I am going to be talking about, Reginald Scot's The Discovery of Witchcraft, was in a way slightly influential. And if you believe some scholars, more than slightly, and to be an influence on the art form that we know today as illusion and stage conjuring. Magic tricks. You see, that's the thing when you do something really quite unique and something unlike anything that had gone before it, is that when you produce something one of a kind, original, put it out in the world, sometimes you don't get a choice as to where it's going to go. and who's going to find it influential and who it's going to touch and how it is going to be used and utilized. You can put your heart and soul into it. It can be one of those things where you know initially from the outset why you are going to produce this work, but once it is out there and in the wider world, you no longer have a choice as to where it goes. And in some cases, it almost seems like that thing has some kind of weird agency all its own. For me, there is no greater example than the book that I'm going to be talking about. And by golly, there are books, and then there are books. There are works, and then there are works. This thing is exceptional in almost every regard. You need to know about this thing. If you're a fan of the history of this kind of stuff and you're not really, a practicing ritual magician, you don't really do spells or stuff like that, the story of this book, you need to know. It's very cool. It's very interesting. It's very fascinating. It will certainly appeal to the occult philosopher within you. But if you're like me, you like doing spells, you like doing rituals and this kind of stuff, my goodness, the information in this book is just precious. It's great stuff. There's so many amazing things in this book. All right. So what exactly am I talking about here? The book, The Discovery of Witchcraft. The Discovery of Witchcraft. I'm going to leave that in. I'm not going to edit that out. Kind of funny. You might have laughed. If you did, thank you. The book is The Discovery of Witchcraft, written by Reginald Scot. First edition, released in 1584 in jolly old England. Some of you very well might remember that I have talked about this book and I have talked about Reginald Scot on a previous episode of the podcast, a couple of podcasts actually, my episode on Cunning Folk being one of them. But most recently, probably the one that might stick in your mind is the episode that I did on demonology. Talked about Reginald and his infamous work in that one as well. Why on earth am I devoting an entire episode to this book? Well, let me tell you. This fellow, Reginald Scot, who I will talk more about his life in a little bit here, released a book for a few reasons. The main one being because of the culture of the time. A lot of people were paying a lot of attention to and a lot of credence to the idea of witches and witchcraft. And he saw some things, noticeably some kinds of injustice surrounding witchcraft persecutions and accusations, and he wanted to do something about it. And so he shored up as much information as he could in 16 books. 16 books make up the Discovery of Witchcraft. And he's basically trying to show that in a lot of cases, the things that are happening, the magic that is occurring, or the witchcraft that is occurring, a lot of times it's down to illusion and trickery. A lot of times the people that would profess to be having some kind of magical ability were imposters. And the reason that they do this a lot of times is because they're not mentally well. And a lot of times the people that are accused of such things as the power of magic and witchcraft are themselves, poorly people, older people that can't take care of themselves, uneducated, illiterate, obviously, prone to fits of fantasy and fancy, and I believe the word he used is to be full of imaginations. I just love that. And so he just collected as much stuff as he could about the beliefs of his contemporary magical world and witchcraft world. The tricks and indeed illusions that were in some way possible, but also just in general the beliefs of a lot of sorcerers and witches and diviners and things of that variety in the hopes that people would see once they read this book that these things are ridiculous and that they're not possible. And as I said, there's a story behind his skepticism and the reason for doing this. I'll get into that in a bit. But what happened is with the release of this book, in a way, it accomplished some of what Reginald Scot was looking to have accomplished. But what also happened is due to the exhaustive and highly detailed nature in which Reginald Scot put this information into these 16 books that make up the Discovery of Witchcraft is that this thing basically became, in a way, the first printed in English grimoire. Something that Reginald Scot most definitely did not want to have happen, his book to be used by people that called themselves magicians and sorcerers. Yet, by the time an edition of his work was released in 1665, a full 81 years since the first publication of the Discovery of Witchcraft and 66 years after Reginald Scot's death, whoever put that out stuffed in some appendices in those things that very clearly geared this work for use as a magical grimoire. So in sum of the sum, The Discovery of Witchcraft is a book that was released out of skepticism for the magical world of its time. By doing so, they collected as much information as they could, put it in the book, released the book, and in hopes of having people see that everything was really dumb and ridiculous and that there's a bunch of fraudsters out there and really not very mentally well people, but also that many of those that are accused of witchcraft are really quite harmless people that aren't doing very well in life, usually. What he did was, in a way, inadvertently democratize and made this information more available to people who would then use it for magic. It's such a weird and interesting story, and I love it so much. Before we get cracking, one of the things that I endeavor to do each and every show that I do is to offer up what sources that I use, or at least the major sources for each and every episode. And in this case, we've got a book and a buddy. Let's start with that book. The book is called England's First Demonologist, Reginald Scot and the Discovery of Witchcraft, produced in 2011. The author is Philip C. Almond, who is an Emeritus Professor of Religion in the University of Queensland. That's in Australia. Philip is a fantastic author. I've talked about one of his books previously on an episode I did about the devil and Satan. He has a book about Satan as well. He also has quite a few of books, really interesting books about the afterlife. He has a book about Noah and the Great Flood. All I'm trying to say is that this guy writes the kind of books that I like reading, and England's First Demonologist is a fantastic read. It is very interesting. It's the kind of book that you need, the one that's a bit distanced. Philip Almond is obviously not a magician like myself, but he definitely goes for the facts, Jack, in the story of Reginald Scot, as well as the book that he produced and the impact of the book on his life and what happens after the book was released. Top marks for this book. I found it very enjoyable. It's absolutely great. So that's one major source for this episode. The other source, that would be the buddy, is none other than the modern cunning man, Dr. Alexander Cummins. You all know Dr. Al. He has been on the show 3 times. Each time he appears on the show, it is always one of my favorites. No one beats Dr. Al, in my opinion. If you like books about magic and grimoires and things of that variety, as you know that I do, well, Dr. Alexander Cummins has quite a few courses available to purchase and learn and enjoy. He has a whole series of them. I believe they're called Libraries of the Sorcerers or Sourcebook series. He has a 3-video lecture series on Scot's Discovery of Witchcraft. It is the absolute best, and a lot of the information for this episode is coming from Dr. Alexander Cummins and his research and work in that class. Highly recommend you checking out his course on Scot's Discovery of Witchcraft if you want to learn more than what I'm sharing here on this episode, because for the sake of time, I obviously can't talk about every single facet of this book and its release. Dr. Al, as always, goes very deep and gives you only the greatest information, not just in this series that he did on the Discovery of Witchcraft, but on things such as the Grimoire Verum, the 4th book of occult philosophy, the Cambridge Book of Magic, the Grimoire Verum, and on and on and on. If it's a big grimoire, he's got a class on it, and it's not just one video. Sometimes they're 6 hours of material worth the price of admission. Honestly, they're all great. We are so lucky that Dr. Al is alive and producing this work at this period of time. So that is the second major source for this show. Check him out. Let's start where we normally start. And in this case, when we're talking about a book of some kind, we have to talk about the author of the book. Who was Reginald Scot? What was his story? And what indeed is the story behind why this book was produced? Again, nothing comes out of a vacuum. There's always a motive, sometimes obvious, sometimes not. In this case, very obvious. Who's Reggie? All right. Reginald Scot was born in either 1537 or 1538. I've seen both dates. Doesn't really matter that much. He was born at Scots Hall in the village of Smeeth near Ashford in Kent. Now, I know it's one of those things that comedians like to make fun of, but I do have to say, as a North American, the names in England of places are so funny. Smeeth, that's just, I love it. Hi, I'm from Smeeth. What do people from Smeeth call themselves? Smeethians? Smeethies? Smeethists? Anyways. Moving on. Anyhow, I just love it. And also, one other thing. Kent, I love Kent. I know a lot of people poo-poo Kent, particularly the part of Kent that is considered part of London, but Kent is just amazing. It's an awesome place. That's where you find Smeeth. That's right. That should be on the billboard as you go into Kent. Kent, this is where Smeeth is. Smeeth is here in Kent. Don't miss Smeeth. Hey, welcome to Kent. Don't you forget about Smeeth. Okay, it's too much. Moving on. All right. So we don't know a ton about his early life. He was the son, the first son, by the way, firstborn son of Richard Scot, himself the son of Sir John Scot, and his wife Mary. Mary was the daughter of the Sheriff of Kent. So these are people that obviously were a deal. They weren't a huge deal, but they were certainly a deal. They were people to be known. Reginald Scot went to Oxford in 1555. Oxford's a university, by the way, right? We should know this. It's like one of the most famous universities in the world, if not in England. Like there's 3 great universities in England. There's Oxford, there's Cambridge, and then there's Hull. That's a Blackadder joke, by the way. Anyhow, moving on. I'm full of beans for this recording. Man, sorry. Focus. So yeah, Reggie went to Oxford. He was 17 years old at the time. Apparently, he did not complete his degree. He went to school and he, I guess, dropped out. He just didn't complete his studies. What did he get up to in his adult years? It appears that he was what was considered a country gentleman, managing property for the most part. Apparently, also at one period of time, he was a member of parliament, a surveyor. He, in some way, was involved with the military, involving training of foot soldiers. We're not entirely sure about that one. But for the interest of this episode, one of the biggest things that he did as an adult was that he was directing the business affairs of his first cousin, Sir Thomas Scot, who was also, in a way, a bit of a patron of his. He would live at Scots Hall for a long period of time. He would have a lot of free time, and that free time allotted him the capacity to basically collect as much information as he could that he would eventually put in Discovery of Witchcraft. But other than that, also apparently he liked gardening. He produced a book on gardening at one point. To be specific, it's about hops cultivation, so there you go. One thing of note that I probably should have mentioned earlier is that while he was living with his cousin, Sir Thomas Scot, obviously because Thomas is a knight and has some money, is that it was a little bit strenuous on his relationship with his cousin, but more so with his cousin's wife, who did not like having Reginald Scot around as much as he was. So while Scott's doing the work in trying to produce this book or get the information for this book, there's a little bit of tension at his accommodations. Reginald was, as pretty much almost most people in England at the time was a Protestant. He had 2 wives, one Jane, who he married in 1568. She passed away, and he married a second woman by the name of Alice Collier. Again, he produced the book, The Discovery of Witchcraft, produced in 1584. I don't believe it was republished in his life, as he passed away, died in Smeath, of course, on the 9th of October in 1599. So he never made it to 1600, but he did indeed get to see how to party like it was 1599. What about this time period that this book was released into? Again, released in 1584. What was 16th century England like as a place? Specifically, what was it like as far as its spiritual ecosystem? This should come as a surprise to almost no one. 16th and 17th century England is such an amazing period of time for magic. I know a lot of people focus on it. You got John Dee there and stuff like that, but it is just extraordinarily fascinating 200 years of English history and culture, magical culture. So pretty much almost everybody believes in magic in some way, shape, or form. I forget which historian and what work it was mentioned in, but they quoted somebody at the time that basically said that the cities in England were clogged with scryers, people that were using show stones to see into the future, just like John Dee or John Dee and Edward Kelly did. Which makes that aspect of their work very much a product of its time. But it's just that everybody was looking into stones and things of that and surfaces to be able to divine the future or talk to entities there and things of that variety. The idea that demons were in some way interacting with human beings at the behest of the devil was a common belief. Pretty much almost everybody believed that, from the lowborn to the highborn. There is the transition from Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, on its way out, basically kicked out by Henry VIII, the guy that likes chopping off wives' heads, got rid of Roman Catholicism, as a consequence of which you have England taking part in the Protestant Reformation, so you have the English Reformation. And of course, when that religious pendulum swings, as it did very much at the time, you have some very strong opinions and very strong ideas about these beliefs and the specific aspects of the religions themselves. It swung back to Catholicism for a very short period of time with the rule of Henry VIII's daughter Mary, but then right back to Protestantism when the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth I, becomes queen. Something else is happening, though, not just in the spiritual ecosystem, but in some way kind of a part of it. And the reason I'm going to bring it up for this podcast episode is that it does very much play into what is happening with this book, is that there is, for some people, particularly those who have money or a capacity to do so, they want, in a way, to make their mark in the world by educating people that don't necessarily have the access to the education that they have. So you have people starting to produce works that, although probably won't be read by the majority of people that need to read it, that maybe perhaps there are those in some kind of echelon in and around the middle that could be able to take such information and share it with those who can't read and can't have this information. So in a way, it's kind of like that pre-Enlightenment pulse beat that you have in England at the time of people trying to get information out to not just, the higher ups. There's this real urge, takes its time to start happening, but when it finally picks up more so in the Enlightenment, of being able to provide information to just help people. And this also goes for some modes of spirituality and eventually, obviously, into things like magic and witchcraft, a la Reginald Scot. This last point is something that I really want to hone in on, and it's one of the things that Dr. Al mentions in his class, that a kind of push in order to provide information geared towards the working classes, to have them not, in a way, wallow in ignorance. And later on, I believe 60 years after the Discovery of Witchcraft, you have something like Culpeper's work on herb remedies and plant remedies and things of that variety, that there's a kind of nobility, in a way, to try and get proper information out there to help people through their health and just in general in the way to live, to make things perhaps just a little bit easier. Dr. Al talks about how there would be remedies for certain kind of ailments at the time, and the list of ingredients would be something like a unicorn horn. And then when you have, Culpeper and giving other somewhat easier to find ingredients for certain remedies, something you could just find if you go down the go in the alley, you might find it poking up through the cracks in the pavement or the cobblestones or something like that. That can be used. That's actual usable stuff. Whereas a mythical animal, or even something as exotic or far out there as the heart of a hoopoe bird or things of that variety. Anyhow, all of this is truly in the water. Very interesting time, very turbulent time, very spiritual time. The invisible world is indeed a very tangible, important part of people's existences, but we're also seeing a country that is in transition as far as the dominant religion at the time. And major religious transitions birth extreme reactions, theologically and otherwise. Probably the biggest thing that was happening in and around the time of Reginald Scot producing this work are the accusations and trials, not just in England, but in continental Europe, against those people who are supposedly agents of the devil, i.e. witches. There was a lot happening as far as witchcraft accusations as well as witchcraft trials, and unfortunately, this is not the podcast in which I can go into every single aspect of them. Obviously, I'm pretty sure that you have some ideas in your mind as to what went on. Of course, as far as people being accused of witchcraft and being brought to trial, a lot of torture was used in some cases to try and get people to confess to certain things. The variety of people that were accused of being witches. One thing that needs to be understood is that everybody wasn't always on board with this. There were always people that, from the outset of a lot of what we could consider the witchcraft persecutions, that thought that what was going on was not good. It was not right. That something like torture was never a good way of extracting confessions. All of these things really played into and seemed to have affected Reginald Scot. And so he, in a way, devoted the cause into this thing of perhaps trying to show people that there's something about witchcraft that is more to meet the eye, and not in the sense that these are people that are in legion with the devil and with demons, that there's something else happening here. I'm pretty sure he also looked at the variety of people that were being accused of witchcraft, and he's pretty sure that a lot of them seem pretty powerless to him, and that this powerlessness is not a trick of the devil, that perhaps these people are not well, both, economically, their life and their hardships, but a lot of times, what we would call something like a mental illness, or even just something as, something as innocuous as a delusion. How did all of this come about? It is not a stretch of the imagination, at least for Reginald Scot. It was not that a lot of these beliefs, a lot of these delusions, a lot of the mental illness and the hang-ups, as well as the accusations, the belief that the true, absolute belief in the corporeal agency of demons and spirits in people's day-to-day affairs was because of Catholicism. It was the older religion, right? So it was the religion that is well on its way out. It's being ousted from England. Witches and sorcerers, they're not pagans, right? They're not practicing an old residue of the magic that came before Christianity ever started to flourish on the British Isles. These people and these beliefs come, for the most part, according to Reginald Scot, came from Catholicism. Not every aspect, according to Scot, but a lot of it. I'd like to share Reginald Scot's definition, or at least what he thinks witchcraft is. And here it is. I quote, "Witchcraft is, in truth, a cozening art." Cozening means duplicitous, duping, tricks, tricksterism, deception. Got it? "Witchcraft is, in truth, a cozening art, wherein the name of God is abused, profaned, and blasphemed, and his power attributed to a vile creature. In estimation of the vulgar people, it is a supernatural work, contrived between a corporal old woman and a spiritual devil. The manner thereof is so secret, mystical, and strange, that to this day there hath never been any credible witness thereof. It is incomprehensible to the wise, learned, or faithful, and it is a probable matter to children, fools, melancholic persons, and papists. And that last bit, a papist is a Catholic. So yeah, he's grouping a lot of folks there together, right? Like children, fools, melancholic persons, and Catholics. That's the people that believe in this thing called witchcraft. So there you have it. There's a couple of things, big things, but that's, as always, the story behind the story. That is the story behind Reginald Scot's skepticism. He is seeing a lot of these ideas and these beliefs of people, and he finds them quite foolish, and he sees that they're being used for somewhat ridiculous and in some way pretty terrifying ends. Ridiculous in the sense that some people are actively trying to fraud other people using trickery, but also people are being accused. Innocent people are being accused, tortured, condemned, killed because of these beliefs. And a lot of these things come straight down. They all funnel down to one root source, and that one root source is usually Catholicism. I want to make it clear, though, and I talked about this in the episode that I did on demonology. I want to make this very perfectly clear because Reginald Scot sometimes gets put up on a pedestal as being one of the first rational thinkers. He's like one of these people that really, as I said, he held aloft the lantern of rational, logical enlightenment values and shone them in the dark corners, or just even walked into the room and illuminated for the first time in an area that was rife with ignorant values and beliefs, to be able to show everybody just how silly that they were. And that's actually not true. He truly believed in a invisible world, in a world in which God has real power. In fact, it's kind of a very odd move, but it is one that Reginald Scot has to own, is that even though we said that what's happening to a lot of these people that are being accused of witches and witchcraft, that they're being abused, tortured, killed, executed, all of those things, that unfortunately a lot of that, this misfortune and the bad stuff is still God's will. It's what happens. It's not right. I don't like it, but also it's God's will. So yeah, his theology and his beliefs would still be seen as being, to most rationalist, logical, fundamental materialist people these days, would still be seen to be abhorrent, backwards, not very educated at all either. So yeah, he's not really he's not the James Randi of his time. There you go. There's another, shithead, skeptic, magician fellow that, I'm saying it. James Randi's trash. But there you have it. It comes from somebody who believes in an invisible world trying to shine their light on another invisible world, and in process just being able to let people see that perhaps that individual world and everything in it, by detailing every aspect of it, perhaps he would be able to help in some way. But yes, a lot of the skepticism comes from a distrust and a disgust, truly, that is starting to take root in England involving Catholicism. There are also three major works that are, in a way, the impetus, as well as one would call them sources for the information that Scot was reacting against, but also to. And I don't have, again, because of time, I don't have time to go through every single one of these sources. I'm just going to talk about them briefly. Dr. Allen, in his class, goes through the sources and the books that Reginald Scot is reacting to very well in his class on this book. Two of these works I have talked about in previous podcasts. I will direct you there when I can. One of these works I actually haven't talked about, and I kind of regret not talking about it in my demonology episode. It was called On the Demon Mania of Witches, produced in 1580. So only about 4 years before Reginald Scot released his The Discovery of Witchcraft. It was written by a lawyer and scholar from France called Jean Baudin. Forgive my ridiculous accent. In this work, he basically talks about and argues in this treatise about the reality and the dangers of magic and witchcraft that Jean thought was an actual existential threat to the state and the cultures of Europe. In the book, he provides recommendations for judges that are part of witchcraft trials to effectively prosecute witchcraft cases. No doubt Scott saw the information in this book as being pretty ridiculous and also in some way quite harmful. And another book in which Scott felt the contents therein were somewhat harmful to his society, at least in his eyes, was a book I've talked about on that demonology episode that I talked about earlier, which is the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. So those two works, again, on the Demon Mania of Witches and the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. There's notes on these two sources in the margins in the printed version, the very first printed version of the Discovery of Witchcraft. There's a ton of them. So he's using these sources and he's kind of picking out stuff that he's very critical of in the Discovery of Witchcraft. Something that he is maybe a little less critical of, but very definitely an influence and a source, is a book I've talked about on so many of my podcasts. That would be Johann Weier's De Prestigis Daemonum, On the Tricks of Demons, which was published in 1563. Again, one of the major takeaways from that book is that a lot of people that are accused of witches are probably mentally not well. They're probably suffering from some kind of psychological neurosis or delusion. All of that stuff was kind of put together. Any kind of mental ailment was grouped together and just called at the time melancholia. But let's not forget, though, that Weyer still, in a way, believed that demons and the devil could interact with this world and could guide some people. It's just that he felt that the majority of people accused of witchcraft probably shouldn't have been. They needed help more than anything. There's some rather infamous segments of De Prestigis Daemonum that make their way into Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft. I'll bring those up when I go through the actual book itself, which will be literally right now. Shitty segue, but it's got to happen. All right, here we go. What is in this book, The Discovery of Witchcraft? Well, I'm actually going to share the entire title because that title page to the first edition of this book that was released in 1584 is overly comprehensive. Are you ready for it? This is the title page. The Discovery of Witchcraft, wherein the lewd dealing of witches and witchmongers is notably detected, the knavery of conjurers, the impiety of incantors, the folly of soothsayers, the impudent falsehood of cozeners, the infidelity of atheists, the pestilent practices of pythonists, the curiosity of figure casters, the vanity of dreams, the beggarly art of alchemistry, the abomination of idolatry, the horrible art of poisoning, the virtue and power of natural magic, and all the connivances of legerdemain and juggling are deciphered, and many other things opened, which have long lied hidden, howbeit very necessary to be known. Hereunto is added a treatise upon the nature and substance of spirits and devils, etc. They were not fooling around with titles back in the day, as I've made note of many times on this podcast. That's truly it, right? That's what he does in this book. A relentless title for a somewhat relentless book. As mentioned earlier, and even in that title there, it is a book composed of 16 books. That's just kind of what they did back in the day. There were books within books that made up the book that you would hold and that you would read. 16 seems like a lot. Indeed it is. This book is indeed a lot, even for its time. Mentioning time, obviously, I don't have the time to talk about every single book within the Discovery of Witchcraft. I can just give a small little taster sample, perhaps, of what's in these 16 books, or what we would probably roundly consider, in a way, chapters, because in each of those books there are sub-chapters. The books or main chapters themselves seem to have a theme to a lot of them, and so maybe I'll go through all 16 of them for folks here. I just want to say, I don't expect everybody that listens to this podcast to read from cover to cover The Discovery of Witchcraft, but no doubt there are certain sections of this book. If you are a practicing magician, or even if you are, as I would call it, an occult philosopher, that you should probably definitely very much read sections of this book. I would recommend reading the whole thing because it's awesome. It's of course it's written in a different way, but it doesn't take long to really get into the swing of things, and just the information in it is awesome. It's hilarious. It's overly detailed. It's somewhat practically detailed as well. This is an astoundingly unique work in every single way. The stories and examples used in them are just, they're great. I'll give you a taste, right? One of the most infamous chapters in the book is a chapter where he talks about what we would call stage magicians and people that were known at the time as jugglers, right? Conjurers, people like, I've mentioned a few of them by name, Penn and Teller, James Randi, you know them, right? And Reginald Scot tells the story of this juggler who was in the presence of a king, and he alerts the king to this dove that's on a rooftop just across out the window, right? He's like, look, king, there's a dove over there. I want to draw your attention to that dove. You can see it's like still alive. It's moving, right? It's not like a painting or like a cardboard cutout. I don't even think they had cardboard back then. Anyways, it's like, look at the bird over there, king. And then there's this picture of a dove on the wall. It's painted on the wall of this really ornate room that the king is in. And the juggler's like, I want you to watch what I'm doing. And so this juggler goes to the painting of the dove on the wall, and he kind of like stabs it with like a knife. He just keeps stabbing it. Stabbing is like, all right, now look at the dove out the window. And the dove, as this guy's like stabbing it, the king, and the people that are there in the room, they all look and they look at the dove, and then the dove falls down dead. It's dead. And everybody's shocked, right? Oh my God. And then there's the belief, and Scot alludes to this. He's like, the belief that these magicians have and jugglers have the power of life and death over people is a very powerful one, right? These are sorcerers that can do amazing things with the use of images and their magic, so much so that if they wanted to, they could kill you very easily. But Scot then says, look, this is what this guy did. Before going up to the room to see the king, he drugged the dove. He gave it like strychnine, and it started to mess the dove up so that when he would release it, the first thing it would do would go up to the rooftop of the closest building, which happened to be the rooftop that was right beside where the king's window was. And he knew that he had like 30 minutes before that dove is going to fall dead. So he just kind of timed it. He knows how to use time. And then he's like, look, king, I want you to look at the dove. And then he proceeded to do his trick, and then it fell down dead. Right? Great story. I love that kind of stuff. All right. So obviously the animal cruelty is not cool. And that's not funny. That's not why I bring this story up, obviously. However, there's so many of these kind of stories, and not just about, again, the stage conjuring segment of the book it's a small part of the full book, but a very, very influential one. The stories and examples in this text are marvelous. They're excellent. They're so great, and they're well worth your time reading it. Again, if you have not, I know a lot of people, particularly practical ritual magicians, give a lot of lip service to this book, and as well they should. But a lot of times they're just giving lip service to sections of the book. And I'm going to go through which sections specifically. But the whole thing is, for the most part, in my opinion, firecracker good. It's not a boring read. There's great stuff all throughout it. All right, what's in this book? Let's talk about each book and what the gist of each book, i.e. chapter of that book, is. Can't go too deep into it, but I will say that if ritual magic is your thing, one hopes that's the reason you're listening to my podcast, I will make note of which chapters perhaps you should pay attention to. Book one's main ambition is to, in a way, set the table. This is the story behind why Reginald Scot wants to do this book on witchcraft. For the most, kind of, if you squint in a way. He talks about just the things that witches are said to be able to accomplish, but more than anything, he talks about, towards the end of this first book, about how people that are inquisitors and witchmongers are, for the most part, cruel. He actually gives them like a full dressing down and calls the actions of these people, the people that accuse most and go seeking witches, of having outrageous and barbarous cruelty. And he kind of ends that first book by basically saying, look, if you in some way are involved in witchcraft accusations, be it on a legal level or otherwise, come at it with compassion. And he specifically calls them old women. Come with compassion. This is not what it appears. And a lot of times this kind of stuff is coming from a really mean place. It's quite wonderful, really. While book 1 lays the table kind of for what is going to go forward for the rest of the book, for the most part, though, he is in a way getting people to further examine what goes on during the accusation and trials of witchcraft. And that's book 2, which deals with inquisitors, confessions, presumptions, interrogations, cautions against witches, torture, the kind of things that witches are accused of. And in that section, he is going back to Jean Baudin's On the Demon Mania of Witches, again produced in 1580. And book 2 ends with talking about torture and what torture does and the things that people he basically says in that last segment to end book 2, torture makes people say crazy shit. I'll read the actual title of that final section. This is what he says: what the fear of death and feeling of torments may force one to do, and that it is no marvel though witches condemn themselves by their own confessions so tyrannically extorted. This is not kid glove stuff. This is Reginald Scot saying that if you partake in this kind of behavior, you're not a good human being, that this stuff is bad. I'm going to do what Dr. Al does in his course, and he smushes books 3, 4, and 5 together. And what you have in these 3 books is basically to quote Dr. Al, the core components of continental Europe demonology, as it would have been familiar to people in Europe and also in England in and around the late 16th century. We're talking, 1580 to 1600. I got a complaint on my demonology episode that I didn't talk enough about what people believe specifically about continental demonology. They were like, oh, I listened to your episode on demonology and I wanted to know what people actually thought about demons. You just kind of mention it just around the periphery, like how they thought that demons can have sex and impregnate people and stuff like that. But I listened to your episode and I wanted that to be the entire basis of your episode. And I just wanted to be like, read the first part of Reginald Scot's The Discovery of Witchcraft. Read the first 5 books of that thing, particularly books 3, 4, and 5. It is an excellent summation of what people believed witches and devils and demons got up to and how they interacted with human beings. Book 3 is specifically about things like the pact with the devil that witches make. Book 4 goes into the details of such things as sexual demons, as I mentioned earlier, how demons can interact with people sexually, incubus, succubus, that sort of thing. Book 5 talks about how witches can transform themselves as well as being able to transform others into other animals. An ass, an owl, apes, dogs, cats, etc. Something interesting happens, though, in the last section in book 5, and it's something that I think is important to talk about, in that he uses the Bible as an example of how we as humans do stupid things when we take things that are not in our original language. And so he talks about certain figures in the Bible and how the translation of them would be translated to witches, even though a lot of the figures that he's talking about, biblical figures that he's talking about, are considered good people. That the way that people are using the Bible then to accuse people of witchcraft is actually really stupid. Part of the rhetorical and theological discussion that was occurring in and around the witchcraft persecutions, the early modern witchcraft persecutions, was whether the witches described in the Bible were the same thing as the people that were being accused of witchcraft. And Reginald Scot in this last chapter in book 5 is basically saying, no, these are translation errors. I'm firmly putting my foot down here and saying that this is all wrong. So in a way, he's almost doing this thing where he's denying that witches were ever a thing at any point. That people at the time are using it. Look, witches are real because they're in the Bible. He's saying that's poorly translated stuff in there. These things are not what you think they are. These witches are not what you think they are. Even if you think that because they're in the Bible, they are a thing and that they're real, that's a mistranslation. It's brilliant stuff. It's wonderful. And as much as I love the magic stuff in this book, there's these other segments that as you're reading through them, it's just they really stick out to you. At least that chapter did to me. It was just like, oh, wow. Yeah, this guy's doing some propeller head level reasonable thinking regarding the unseen world and the invisible world. The last line of book 5 is him directly saying, what you see as a witch now, this is what he says, you shall not read in the Bible of any such witches or of any such actions imputed to them. It's wonderful. It's great stuff. Some of you might be like, all right, this is all well and good. Demonology, witches, beliefs about witchcraft. When do we start talking about the magic stuff? Well, that doesn't really kick in for the most part until books 6 through 16. Book 6 deals with things like poisoning or veneficium. Starts kind of strangely off with, Reginald Scot was certainly a product of his time. It starts off with Reginald's, fantastic observation that women have poisoned men all throughout history, more so than men have poisoned men, right? He said that, with one hand he giveth, and with one hand he taketh away. He ended a book talking about, mistranslations of the Bible, and the next chapter is, let me tell you how women have been poisoning dudes. It's a thing. It always has been a thing. More so than men poison men. Yeah, right. Book 7 is a somewhat odd one. It talks about, I think, ventriloquism. It's maybe not the best way of describing what he's getting on here. He's basically talking about how people have been deceived through trickery, particularly things like oracles or those who consider themselves prophets, that perhaps deceit through communication was a large part of what they were doing. And he even brings up the Witch of Endor and whether she actually raised Samuel truly, or if that was trickery and deceit as well. It is an interesting book. It's an interesting chapter. It's not as focused as some of the other books within the Discovery of Witchcraft. Book 8 talks about cessationism. This is an interesting concept. Some of you might be familiar with it. Some of you might not be. The idea is that after Jesus and the apostles, miracles just don't happen anymore. Like, they were the last time that something that we can consider a miracle occurred, that after the death of John the Apostle, John the Evangelist, after he passed away, that there just haven't been any more miracles. They ceased to be. I know this is it's an interesting concept. If you're already familiar with cessationism, as I was before I read Discovery of Witchcraft, this is kind of like a boring chapter or book within the Discovery of Witchcraft, at least for me. You might find it interesting. Book 9 talks about divination. And in this one, he brings up several examples, and he also just kind of talks about, when people try to divine, a lot of times they're pretty ridiculous and in many cases impious. The chapter is very skeptical as far as the capability of people who do divination, just in general, which leads into book 10, wherein he's talking about divination that has occurred in dreams. As we all know, from things as far back as the Greek magical papyri, there's dream sending, you trying to put certain dreams into people to maybe make them fall in love with you and all of that kind of stuff. What does Reginald Scot have to say about all of that nonsense? He says it's all nonsense. He has a little bit in this chapter of this book about people doing treasure hunting from dreaming about dreams. Has a little segment there talking about, the dream flights of witches. It's not very detailed, it's just kind of a bit of a mention, as well as such things as the assembly of witches. So, for folks, he doesn't use the word, but that would be Sabbath. Interesting perspectives in Book 10, but it's nothing compared to Book 11. Book 11 is about augury. For those, it's an older term. I know most of you should know what augury is. For those that don't know what augury is, it's just observing omens in certain things. I believe originally, specifically, it came to the Romans to be looking at the behavior of birds and being able to see omens in the flight and the behavior of the birds themselves. This is a strange and interesting chapter in the Discovery of Witchcraft. Because he kind of starts off with, poo-pooing augury and those that would augur, and then he gets into how you do it. He talks about if animals do certain things in certain places, like if a crow croaked at a house and the moon was here, and it's just astrologically what needs to happen. Some really good information in this chapter, the kind of stuff that, would be used by people. I want to learn about augury, and I know nothing. It's like, well, there's a chapter in this book that says you shouldn't do it, and doing it is foolish, but it also tells you how to do it. Oh, Reggie. Book 12 has enchantments, and there's quite a few chapters here. Very practical chapter for ritual magicians, and very definitely this chapter was one of the ones after this book was published that many a cunning magician or service magician would have paid great attention to. Starts off with talking about how words have a certain kind of power, and then it goes into talking about, I think he calls them popish enchantments and very Catholic ways of using charms and enchantment. Goes through a part of a process of how to create holy water here. And one of the chapters is just it's a huge list of charms for a lot of things. How to help a pregnant woman, spoil a thief, cure headaches, open a lock, toothaches, and the very, very, very important, for the time at least, charm to stop wine from turning into vinegar. Don't you hate when your wine turns into vinegar? The worst. Towards the end of this chapter, this book, is a charm on how to hurt somebody with images made out of wax. A little bit of maleficum there. Yeah, this chapter is interesting in just where he's pulling as much information as he can gather about charms and what kinds of charms there are, about all sorts of things, natural ailments, how to help cattle and everything. And he just crams them into this one chapter. Very useful chapter. Book 13 is the book that a lot of people pay attention to, particularly because of the fact that this is where it talks about magicians. And it starts off with this idea of what is a natural magician. There is a kind of natural magic that is exemplified by the glory of God, which was a truly philosophical and theological argument that had been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years all over Europe about what's the difference between, magic and natural magic, magic that we consider to be not good versus, the magic that is okay, the magic that exemplifies the wonder and splendor of our Lord God. So he tussles with this and he talks about it. And then he switches gears and he starts talking about what we know now as stage magic, about illusion and conjuring, about juggling. Goes into cards and card tricks, all of this. That story I shared about the person that stabbed the picture, the portrait of, or just the artistic representation of a dove, and then caused a dove to die that was on a building that they could see out their window. That's from this chapter. This book, Book 13, is the reason that magicians talk about this book, because it is considered to be the very first time how to do tricks was published in book form in the English language. And specifically, this chapter of this book was put into, just ripped wholesale out of the Discovery of Witchcraft. Everybody's like, this stuff about witchcraft and the devil, that's not really my thing. But they took this chapter about how to do magic tricks and put them in their own books on how to be a juggler or do magic tricks or conjuring or illusions. This chapter is kind of infamous because it's got woodcut illustrations of how to do certain kinds of illusions, including, how to make it appear like somebody has had their head cut off, and that it shows the table that has two holes in it, the two holes in the top of the table, and one hole is where somebody lays their body with their head tucked into one of the holes, and then somebody is sitting under the table on a stool with their head poking up through the hole. And it seems like so simple to us now, but this was something that Reginald felt he had to put in his book, because this was an aspect of the magical world that people were using magic tricks for deceptive purposes. And truth be told, the distinction between magician using supernatural magic and magician using illusion, they would not have been distinct. Not like we have it now. They would have been the exact same thing. So it includes a lot of ways on how one can do magic tricks. It's actually a fascinating chapter. I know a lot of people try to keep stage magic and illusion at arm's length, particularly because, those instances that I mentioned earlier where when you tell somebody you're a magician, they're like, show me a magic trick. And you're like, nah, that's not what I do. I still think it's actually part of the story of magic, and it's an important one. And to see in Reginald Scot's The Discovery of Witchcraft the introduction of instruction booklets and how to do magic tricks. I remember my brother for a period of time was very fascinated in doing stage magic for about 2 years. And he bought these implements and certain things like wands that could do kind of weird stuff. Those were interesting enough to me, but there would be these booklets that would come with it that would show you how to do all manner of these things. I always found those more interesting than the actual implements themselves. And all of that stuff, it starts with Reginald Scot. It starts with The Discovery of Witchcraft, and it starts with Book 13. Very important chapter, even if, stage magic and conjuring is not your thing. It's a very unique cultural artifact to go through this chapter. And just it starts off, again, with the idea of what's natural magic, and then it says, well, here's natural magic, and then here's fraudulent illusion and trickery and conjuring and card magic and all of those kind of things. It's wonderful. And as I said, very important to our Western cultural history. Magic tricks. Everybody loves magic. It's a huge aspect of us and what we do. We love them. Book 14 is a somewhat short chapter compared to the rest of the chapters in this book. It's about alchemy, right? And just kind of have some stories about alchemy, and that ends with him basically saying that alchemists or puffers, people trying to do alchemy, are, in his words, bootless, which means that what they're doing is entirely useless. They're dumb. You're dumb trying to do this. And in a way, it's interesting that it's there because book 14, which is one of those books that I think is pretty boring, leads into book 15, which is, it's the best. This is the one. Book 15 is the reason that we talk about the discovery of witchcraft. It's a bit of a funny chapter, though, for a couple of reasons. One that I'm going to bring up right away, and one I'm going to save for a little bit later on in the episode. This is where almost all of the magical knowledge is put in this book. Before I talk about, the kind of things that are in this chapter, there's a really interesting aspect and another source for Scot's discovery of witchcraft that I find very fascinating. So I saved it to share it here, because this book, Book 15, is all about conjuration and spirits and evocation, stones, seals, fairies, saints, goes through, all the tools, it's a lot of the techniques for doing these, the kind of, like, this is what you have all most likely been waiting for when I talk about this book. It's book 15, and then a discourse at the end of the book, and then these appendices that was put in there later that I hinted at a little bit earlier. That's the reason that we're still, besides the stage magic stuff, book 15, discourse, and appendices are the reason that we talk about this book on magic podcasts, and why folks like Dr. Al and myself really think that this is such an important work. Anyhow, it seems that Reginald Scot went to some cunning folk in order to get information about ritual conjuring magic, and it is from these cunning folk that we have such wonderful, exhaustive, highly detailed information regarding the kind of ritual magic that would have been around at the time, which obviously includes the kind of stuff that is so detailed that if you were to pick up this book 15, you yourself could probably, if you knew how and you could read, could probably do this kind of magic. What exactly are we talking about here? I'm going to quote from the fantastic author Owen Davies. I remember him. He wrote a book about grimoires, which is a book that everybody, if you hear my voice and you find this interesting, you need to own that book. But there's another book that he has that's also awesome called Popular Magic, Cunning Folk in English History. This is what he has to say about this whole situation. According to Scot, one of his main sources of knowledge on ceremonial magic was a manuscript called Secretum Secretorum, The Secret of Secrets, which was the work of one T.R., written in fair letters of red and black upon parchment and made by him in 1570. He also mentions another man, John Cocars, in relation to the manuscript. According to Scot, in the beginning of their book of conjuration, it was stated that it was invented and devised for the augmentation and maintenance of their living, for the edifying of the poor, and for the propagating and enlarging of God's glory. Judging from these words, TR's use of magic was not restricted to private occult experimentation, but was rather a matter of public service for financial gain. We can speculate then that TR was no more or less than a cunning man. His manuscript was in English, but where TR obtained his information from and how Scot came by it is unknown, although it certainly did not derive from any work printed in English. Now, what exactly was this thing, this Secretum Secretorum? It was a personal grimoire, and most likely it had a lot of information that would be called nowadays a clavicula. It probably was a Key of Solomon. The section of Book 15 wherein Scot mentioned this work by TR, Secretum Secretorum, is right after Reginald Scot lists 69 infernal spirits that are pretty much the same as the listed spirits in Johann Weyer's De Prestigiis Daemonum, in that added part to De Prestigiis Daemonum called Pseudomonarchia Daemonum, which was added to the manuscript in 1563. If some of you were like, what the hell are you talking about, Douglas? Please listen to my episode called Goetia, Goetia. I go through all of this confusing stuff in greater detail on that episode. Anyhow, Pseudomonarchia Daemonum, the false monarchy of demons, that is the basis of the spirits, the infernal spirits that are in the Ars Goetian. Yes, these are in Reginald Scot's The Discovery of Witchcraft as well. A document that I should remind you was compiled before the Lesser Key of Solomon or the Ars Goetia that is in there. There are some differences between Scot's list and Johann Weyer's list. We would also do well to remember that Johann Weyer purposefully excluded some spirits from the Pseudomonarchia Daemonum, his list of infernal spirits, and that would be the big three. So instead of 72 spirits like that in the Ars Goetia, there's only 69, because he decided to omit the big three again: Lucifer, Beelzebub, and Satan. So you get those guys out of there. Johann Weyer thought that if I exclude these, then people can't use this list that I put in my book to do their own magic, right? That was his thinking, at least. But as I said, there are discernible differences between the infernal spirits, the 69 infernal spirits that are in The Discovery of Witchcraft, and the 69 spirits that are in Johann Weyer's Pseudomonarchia Daemonum. We're not entirely sure. I could be wrong about this, and I'm too lazy to look it up right now. I don't know if we know for sure whether he got the spirit list from Johann Weyer. We know he read Johann Weyer's De Prestigiis Daemonum because he references it. It's one of his sources. We're not sure which edition he read, if he read the 1563 edition that had the Pseudomonarchia Daemonum, the false monarchy of demons, added to it. But in the text itself, he adds a little bit of confusion about this infernal demons list. He says that this is the work of one TR. Anyhow, all of this is to say a couple of things. The first one being that a lot of this stuff, at least from the word of Reginald Scot, a lot of the information in Book 15 is from a couple of cunning folk. It certainly doesn't sound like he made it up. It sounds like these people were sharing actual information with it, and he was just writing it all down just to get it out there into the world. But that it also shows that this kind of evocatory ritual magic and those spirits were around. They were a real going concern, and if cunning folk know about them, most likely they're a somewhat notorious group, which all just leads to the conclusion reached in the book The Transformations of Magic by Frank Claassen, that for the most part, while we'd like to think of this period of time that the kind of magic that John Dee was doing, the kind of austere angel magic stuff, is an outlier. That's not the norm. The norm is what they would have referred to at their time as necromancy, or as we call it now, or at least I call it negromancy. Spirit conjuring. Good old fashioned drawing a circle on the floor and conjuring spirits. We got to keep moving here. Book 15 is great. Book 15 is, again, the book that ritual magicians go to for the most part, or at least one of the major ones that they go to, because the information is so good. I will have a little bit more to say about Book 15 later on in this podcast, which brings us to the last book, Book 16. Well, kind of the last book. The last book as far as, numbered books or chapters are concerned. This is a relatively, no-nonsense chapter. He's just basically trying to tell you everything that he thinks you need to know, that those who persecute and make a living out of finding and persecuting and accusing witches they're awful people. To remind you that everything that you think witches are capable of is untrue. They can't do the things you think they can. And then he kind of pulls a 1967 Beatles thing and ends his book. Indeed, the very last chapter in the very last book, chronologically, he ends it where he just talks about natural magic for love. Aw, all you need is love. Right? Kind of romantic little gesture there, pulled by Reggie. Reggie probably had a big heart. Probably, he was probably a bit of a romantic kind of dude. He seems like it. At least you kind of get that feeling when you read The Discovery of Witchcraft. He was a lover, not a fighter. But that's not true, actually. He trained foot soldiers. Anyways, he was a lover and a fighter. Here's the thing, though. That's not exactly how the book ends. Well, at least not the first published 1584 version of The Discovery of Witchcraft. The book actually ends with a large tract on a very specific thing and a very, very specific belief that Reginald Scot has. That is a whole other book tacked on the end of this thing called A Discourse Upon Devils and Spirits, which is quite long. It is composed of 34 chapters, this last little bit of The Discovery of Witchcraft. It's an odd one. It's kind of, and another thing. Reginald Scot closes the door, and you're like, wow, Reginald seemed to have a lot to say. And then the door blows open again, and he's like, and I got more to say. And you're like, here we go. This is where Reginald Scot basically is telling everybody, anybody that will listen, anybody with the book, that spirits are real. I believe in spirits, but they cannot interact with us corporeally. They can't possess us, have sex with us. They can't do any of the things everybody thinks that they can do. It is impossible. Spirits can't do that. He basically argues that when people think that they're being assaulted by demons or the devil specifically, that their misfortune and the things that they fear are happening to them are not because of the devil or of demons, that they're suffering spiritually. He calls these assaults not temporal, which is an interesting way of putting it. What you get a sense of with this added section to the end of the first edition of Reginald Scot's The Discovery of Witchcraft is indeed, as Philip Almond talks about quite a bit in his book, and it's an important, and I'm going to make the distinction here, is that this is a person who believes, he truly believes in God. He truly believes that there are things such as God's will. He does think that there are spirits, but he thinks that the way that everybody thinks how these things interact with us, how they have all of this power over us, all of that stuff, and even again, as I said, going against the beliefs of Johann Weyer, who still believed in spirits and believed that they could interact with us, he's firmly of the opinion in this discourse saying, this is not true. There are spirits, but they can't interact with us, period. And that's why Philip Almond was just like, this guy can't be considered. You know, he's not as rational, and he's not holding aloft that lantern of rational enlightenment values that a lot of people think that he is. He's got his own personal theology and his way of looking at the world that it was very much a product of his time and his circumstances and his place in society, which will, as I'll get into in the next little bit here, it did not really help him or his work, at least the reception of his work in any way. There you have it. That is what is in the first edition, produced in 1584, The Discovery of Witchcraft. At the time, printed 488 pages in 16 books, 249 chapters, and that final little section, 71 pages in 34 chapters. Oh my goodness. What a beast of a document. What a beast of a book. It's incredible. But the story of this book specifically doesn't end because something happens to it a little bit later on, but I do want to talk about the reception of this book once it was put out. What happened to it? Where did it go? How was it received? Allow me to start with a little bit of myth busting. There is this idea that when the incoming new monarch of England, that would be James Stuart, otherwise known as James VI of Scotland or James I of England, he became King of England in 1603, so after the publication of The Discovery of Witchcraft, and certainly after the death of Reginald Scot in 1599, he believed in witches. There's this whole thing that happened with him and witches, known as the North Berwick Witch Trials. Moving on, this guy, he certainly believed in witches. There's a myth that when he came into power, he was not a fan of Reginald Scot's skepticism about spirits and witches, and he ordered to have all copies of the first edition of Reginald Scot's The Discovery of Witchcraft burned. Not true. There's zero evidence for this. In fact, finding original copies of The Discovery of Witchcraft is, according to one scholar, S.F. Davies, in actually a great source, a source for this episode as well that I should probably mention, as pretty much almost all of the information for this section about the reception of the book comes from this essay that he wrote called The Reception of Reginald Scot's Discovery of Witchcraft, Witchcraft, Magic, and Radical Religion, which he wrote and released in 2013. Awesome article. It will be in the show notes. If you have a JSTOR account, you can just read them for free. Anyways, well worth reading. Wow, I went off on a bit of a tangent there. Anyways, what I'm trying to say is that according to this scholar, S.F. Davies, finding original copies of Reginald Scot's The Discovery of Witchcraft, produced in 1584, is actually not that rare. It's not really a rare book. It's rarer than, finding copies of the Da Vinci Code, obviously, and stuff like that, or Harry Potter books or whatever, but there's actually quite a few copies. We have lots of copies of first editions of Reginald Scot's The Discovery of Witchcraft. Back to James. James was not a fan of The Discovery of Witchcraft. He was not a fan of what Reginald Scot had to say in this book, and he produced his own demonology called Demonology in response, in a way, to Reginald Scot's The Discovery of Witchcraft. The reception that this book received, that is, The Discovery of Witchcraft, the reception that James gave it was pretty much the reception that most people at the time gave this book. It did not have a good reception. Many other authors issued their own refutations of Reginald Scot's work. One author saying that this book was full of horrible impieties, and that Reginald Scot himself should be commended to Vulcan. That is not a Star Trek reference, by the way. You should probably know who Vulcan is, right? Outside of the whole Star Trek universe. It's a town in southern Alberta, province in Canada that I grew up. But it's also another thing. Some people did not like this book or Reginald Scot. He gets accused of being an atheist, which was a big thing back in the day, truly. It was. And in fact, this author, this critic of Reginald Scot says that, the reason that this Discovery of Witchcraft didn't cause witchcraft to go away is because of atheists like Reginald Scot. It has to be said, though, and S.F. Davies makes it very clear in his essay that reception was a bit mixed, but there was a lot of very positive reactions to Reginald Scot. Quite a few works produced after the Discovery of Witchcraft were using the first edition as a resource when they would write about witchcraft. This is particularly in England specifically, although a little bit in continental northwestern Europe. In the early 17th century, there was a lot of controversy in England about exorcism and exorcists, and quite a few authors that would tackle the idea of exorcism would actually go use the methods that Reginald Scot used in the Discovery of Witchcraft. And by methods, I mean using the Bible as a resource to basically say that, these are mistranslations about what witches actually are, and that the idea of exorcism as it existed in the New Testament is different than how it appears in England at the time. So yes, they'd use his book as a major tool for getting their point across, which actually eventually drifted into the higher echelons of the Church of England. You had clergymen who were familiar with a lot of these ideas, and they would start to have their minds changed about what spirits can actually do. With one author in the 1650s, although that's a little bit later than the early 17th century, but he basically said that the ideas promulgated by Reginald Scot within the Discovery of Witchcraft, I quote, did for a time make great impression in the magistracy and also in the clergy. There's something that gets alluded to quite a bit when the Discovery of Witchcraft gets brought up, in that it was an influence on William Shakespeare for the three witches. They're never really called witches in Macbeth, I don't believe. I'm not an expert on Shakespeare. I absolutely love the work, and I have quite a lot of it memorized, including, the thing that everybody memorize from Macbeth of these three characters: double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble, fillet of a fenny snake in the cauldron, boil and bake, eye of newt and toe of frog, wool of bat and tongue of dog, adder's fork and blindworm's sting, lizard's leg and howlet's wing, for a charm of powerful trouble, like a hell broth boil and bubble. Anyhow, these three characters in the play written by William Shakespeare, Macbeth, it's said in many places that the Discovery of Witchcraft was the inspiration for these three characters, and I've read some essays that try to make that point, and I'm unfortunately rather unconvinced. Shakespeare, if they existed, it's a whole other thing there. Anyways, no doubt, if they existed, please don't email me. I know. Okay, anyways. They would have been aware of this book, but just as a direct reference to these three characters in Macbeth from the Discovery of Witchcraft, I find it a bit of a stretch. But apparently, the Discovery of Witchcraft, and some people have said, and it's also alluded to in Philip Ullman's book, England's First Demonologist, that Scott's work was an inspiration for these three significant characters in the play Macbeth. I don't really see it. I've tried. I don't see a direct correlation. Personally, that's just me. So besides that, I talked about it a little bit earlier, but the chapter on stage magic and illusion and stage conjuring was highly influential. We see two books, The Art of Juggling and Legerdemain, as well as Hocus Pocus Jr., released in 1612 and 1634, respectively. basically take that entire section, just reword it and put it in their books. And these were books that were trying to show people how to do stage magic. All that can be said about the first edition of Reginald Scott's The Discovery of Witchcraft is that it certainly had an impact. It was a book that was talked about. If people knew about the book, they knew about the book. It was influential in a lot of people's way of seeing the world and how they interacted with their world. Obviously, there was some ire, not just from the king of the time, James I, but also from other scholars and authors. While it did have an impact, it has been mentioned specifically by Philip Almond, the author of England's First Demonologists. Very clearly, the kind of theology that Scot put out into the world was one that was radical. It was too radical for its time. People still truly believed, and people in every echelon, every part of society still really believed that the devil and demons can interact with human beings. And Scott's position on this was just something that most people could not comprehend. And a lot of people actually thought that, Scot just doesn't mean it, right? He says these things, but he probably doesn't mean it. And I think that it's crazy that people thought that at the time. But that's how egregious this theology that Reginald Scot has of God's will and the capabilities of spirits. And I think that's the reason that this book, after its first publication, in a way fizzled out. It was not a blockbuster. People weren't running all over the place. The first reprints of the Discovery of Witchcraft don't even occur in England. They're in Holland, I believe, or the Netherlands. And that doesn't occur until 1609 and 1637. In some, I'm going to pull a quote from Leland Estes in their essay, Reginald Scot and His Discovery of Witchcraft, Religion and Science in the Opposition to the European Witch Craze. It was not reprinted in English for almost 3/4 of a century after its first publication. Scott's theology just was not widely acceptable. At no time in the early modern period, in fact, were most people willing to concede the merely spiritual existence of the devil. Not only would such a concession have been considered tantamount to atheism, but perhaps more importantly, it would have been repugnant to common sense. Everyone knew that demons existed corporeally because almost everyone thought that they had some kind of physical contact with them. In a way, it seems that the direction that Scot had, the points he was trying to make, were just so out of step with his time, it was hard for people to comprehend what he was trying to accomplish. The book, in a way, just disappeared. It, as I said, it fizzled out for a time. But you can't keep a good thing down. People know a good thing when they see it, although that good thing was certainly not the good thing that Reginald Scot wanted. While Reginald Scot would be probably extremely happy that there was a reprint of his book in England in 1651. Keep in mind, that is 67 years, 7 years between the printing of the second edition and the printing of the first edition in English. That's a long time. Why did it take so long? What was going on? I'll tell you what was going on. Witchcraft was going on. In England, huge upsurge of interest in witchcraft, as well as a huge upsurge in the skepticism of witchcraft. What happened? Well, the largest witch hunt in English history occurred, and that was the East Anglian witch hunt of Matthew Hopkins and John Stearne that occurred in the mid-1640s. If you're unaware of this event, in short, it was terrible. And what happened was more than 100 people were killed, were hanged. Added to this, you have, of course, the English Civil War. People are angry, lots of turmoil. When there's turmoil, supernatural and paranormal beliefs increase. Witchcraft is hot again. And when something gets hot, culturally, what happens? People tend to try and sell things. So what happens in 1651 is that the Discovery of Witchcraft gets reprinted, not once, but twice, in a format known as Quattro. And what happens is that they change. The publisher, Richard Coates, changes the title. And it's an interesting change. It's a distinct change. And it is a change that is very definitely a product of its time, because it adds to that long title. Remember that long title that I said was on the front page of the Discovery of Witchcraft? It mentions lewd practices of witchmongers. In the second reprint, both second reprints, it adds extra stress on how these witchmongers extort confessions by inhumane terrors and tortures, something that was not there originally. And that is most likely very definitely a reference to the witch hunter Matthew Hopkins and how he would go about persecuting witches. While witchcraft and witch hunting would have been on people's minds once again in the mid-1600s, the second reprinting, both of them, did not do very well. We are not too sure why the reprinting of this work didn't do very well. There was a reissue of the old sheets from the second edition that was released in 1654, did nothing. I suspect that probably wasn't marketed very well. The publishers didn't really put anything else that was adjacent to witchcraft in their catalog. This is just seemingly like a one-off. They were just like, people are talking about witches, let's get this book out. And then it failed. It didn't do anything, so it just kind of went away. So they just didn't, they didn't try anymore. It didn't do anything, so they just kind of stopped. And yet, like a weird bad penny, Reginald Scot's The Discovery of Witchcraft just, for some reason, keeps coming up. People were still talking about it, but it was definitely not the sort of people that Reginald Scot would have wanted. Because that leads us to the printing of the edition of The Discovery of Witchcraft that is the most notorious edition of this book, and it is the one that, to this day, I recommend to absolutely everybody for, extremely obvious reasons. You see, The Discovery of Witchcraft started to become a bit more notorious to people who believed in magic and folks who would do their own ritual magic. That's right. People were using Reginald Scot's The Discovery of Witchcraft not as a work wherein they can delve deep into whether or not witchcraft is a real thing or witches are real. But no, they were there for those instances that occur so often in The Discovery of Witchcraft, where Reginald Scot gives exhaustive, very detailed information about how to do certain kinds of magic and charms and all of that great stuff. That's right. So we start to see the grimoire tradition on board and swallow up The Discovery of Witchcraft and use it for its own purposes. So this leads us to perhaps one of the most interesting parts of The Discovery of Witchcraft, which is the release of the 1665 third edition. What is going on here? Well, you see, it became obvious to the publisher, Andrew Clark, that The Discovery of Witchcraft was, as I said, being used for magical purposes. So they decided to insert some material into this book. Material that Reginald Scot would have fucking hated. He would have hated it because it basically went against everything that Reginald Scot believed, particularly about how spirits can't corporeally interact with human beings. What exactly are these new editions? Do you remember earlier when I was talking about Book 15? Well, in 1665, the third edition, Book 15 has nine new chapters added at the very beginning of Book 15 concerning all sorts of magical goodies. And it's great stuff. It's wonderful. How to consecrate a magical circle, fumigations, fire, utensils to use, other weird, interesting rituals. Also, at the very end of the book, you know how there's that discourse on devils and spirits that Reginald Scot had there? Well, the 1665 edition of The Discovery of Witchcraft has a second book tacked onto a discourse concerning devils and spirits. Very much like the first one, but also entirely not like the first one. It's just in title alone. It's just called Book 2. This one talks about astral spirits, the distinct different kinds of spirits, how to bring about their assistance, talks about infernal spirits, what their powers are, their names. There's forms of charms. And it ends with a brief talking about exorcisms. And yeah, that's it. But this new material is for ritual magicians wonderful. It's great. As I said, Reginald Scot would have been aghast that this material was lumped in with his book. But what we have here is a little bit of a whodunit, because we're not exactly sure who put this material in there, or the specific reasons that the variety of material that was added in the 1665 edition is there, the kinds of things that are in there, and indeed whether or not the material that was added comes from some kind of earlier source, whether it was all made up, just somebody who did this really leaning into the fantastical elements of what was considered ceremonial or ritual magic at the time. There's a lot that can be unpacked. We really have no idea. There's some folks. I believe there's a book that was released, or 3 books actually released not too long ago by John Madziarchik called The Magicians Discovered. Yeah, 3 books. I haven't had a chance to read them. Goes into this stuff apparently in quite good detail. Yeah, it's weird. This new material, again, I don't want to make too much of a point of it, but it sticks out like a sore thumb, particularly if you've read the original printing of The Discovery of Witchcraft, and then you go back and read the bits as to when they are added and where they are added. And they just stick out because it goes against everything. The major thesis of Reginald Scot's The Discovery of Witchcraft is entirely different than this new stuff that is very obviously there and geared towards people actively doing magic. And it's fucking great information. It's so good. Beyond a doubt, it's this new material, this stuff, the stuff at the very end, like the second appendix, and the stuff that was added at the beginning of Book 15 is splendidly awesome for use for ritual magic. Now somebody might be like, well, what if somebody just made it up? Like, what if it's not real? It doesn't matter. If it's good, and here's the thing, people have been using this for a long time. Since 1665, people have been like, this is good stuff. This is good advice. The episode that I'm going to be producing on Patreon after this episode is released is going to go through some of the material that is in the 1665 edition, specifically one ritual, as well as mulling over 2 ritual magic standards for, I'm just going to say, evocatory ritual magic, Solomonic magic, that I want to draw people's attention to, things that are considered unbendable rules within magic that Reginald Scot's work. Some of it, the 1665 stuff, a little bit not the 1665 stuff that just says we can actually bend on this sort of thing. But particularly, I'm going to be focusing for that episode, that Patreon episode, on one ritual that I think is fairly interesting, and it's just worthy of looking at, I believe. Because I'm going to be examining, there's this idea, what if this stuff is made up? What if this is not real magic? What if somebody just pulled this ritual out of their ass? They've read a little bit of work, and obviously this stuff wasn't written by a magician. It was written by a fantasist, and they just stuffed it into the 1665 edition to make money. Sure, let's go on that, and let's examine the ritual, and let's look at the elements of this that seem fantastical, and see why the elements work together and can actually be an effective, interesting ritual. Going to be talking about a little ostension, if you will, regarding some of the material from the 1665 edition of Reginald Scot's The Discovery of Witchcraft. So if you like what I'm talking about so far, and you'd like me to take apart and put back together in the context of looking at the action of making manifest something that is perhaps fantastical into ritual magic, Patreon is where you want to be. Patreon.com/whatmagic is this, $7 a month, etc., etc. I'll talk about this at the end of the episode. Anyways, very excited to do that episode after this one drops. Back to the action. There's already some good information that people can use in the original, The Discovery of Witchcraft, again, produced in 1584. But this really just kind of bolsters that. And this really plays into that idea. And by plays into, I'm using that purposefully because this stuff is very clearly there because people are using this book as a grimoire, which is, I hate to say it, besides the small segment on stage magic and conjuring, the reason that it has endured since 1665 is the material that was used by practical magicians and cunning folk. So this leads us into the enduring legacy of the Discovery of Witchcraft and why I think it's quite important. When it all comes down to it, there might be a touch of argument, but I'm going to basically go with this and go with the word of the author Owen Davies, in that although this is certainly not what Scot wanted to have happen, due to the hard work of Reginald Scot, he democratized. He made this information more available to people, and they absolutely loved it. I'm going to quote Owen Davies once more from his book, Grimoires, A History of Magic Books. The work was a treasure trove of magical information, providing spells, Catholic prayers, exorcism, charms, talismans, and rituals on how to communicate with angels, demons, and the spirits of the dead. There were detailed instructions on conjuring up treasure and how to enclose a spirit in a crystal. Scot produced what amounted to the first grimoire printed in the English language, and while he did so to prove the worthlessness of its contents, he unwittingly ended up democratizing ritual magic rather than undermining it. That is truly the greatest legacy of this book, I feel. I mean, I am prejudiced, obviously. It has to be said just how influential this work was as far as ritual magic is concerned, particularly in what we would call the English-speaking world, or places in which English was the main language. However, you find the woodcut illustrations pertaining to magic in all variety of grimoires produced, particularly here in the New World. I once bought a book of St. Cyprian in Mexico, and these things are just kind of cobbled together from all kinds of sources, and a lot of the stuff in there was from Reginald Scot's The Discovery of Witchcraft. You know, a Spanish/Portuguese-ish tradition of grimoires, the Cyprian grimoires, and it's using illustrations from Reginald Scot's The Discovery of Witchcraft. There's seals and talismans that are pictured in The Discovery of Witchcraft that we are finding. Charms and seals and talismans, drawings of these things are written on paper in old buildings when we're doing reconstruction, tucked into the inside of chimneys, hidden away from plain sight, only uncovered when we start taking these old buildings apart. And they are exactly the same as the seals in Scot's Discovery of Witchcraft. It's the oldest representation of these seals that we have. And they obviously go just straight back to Reginald Scot's The Discovery of Witchcraft. Astoundingly popular because of the fact it was just so readily available. There is something else that I certainly need to mention, and it is something that I think is one of the most acute observations from Dr. Alexander Cummins, and it makes its way to us via a older commercial cultural reference in his class about Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft, in that the highly skeptical and somewhat cynical view taken on magic in this book, but with also having within it itself highly detailed, practical, magical information. It basically had the equivalent of the the 90s parental advisory warnings that would be on the front covers of CDs and audio tapes. Like if you had that badass label on your album, people were more likely to buy it. It did the exact opposite of what it wanted to do. The warning became a badge of enticement. You knew that what you were getting was something awesome. It's a perfect encapsulation of what happened with this book eventually. The younger the younger listeners might not know what I'm talking about. You missed a golden age, young bloods. You really, really did. The magical impact of this work is one that is even attested to within the record. We have instances of people that were accused of doing magic or witchcraft in some way. And from their records, they directly point out that something that they had was Reginald Scot's Discovery of Witchcraft. I'm going to quote here from Philip Ullman's book, England's First Demonologist. I quote, "Indeed, we can gain some insight into the use of Scot's book for divinatory or conjuring purposes from an account by the Essex Justice Sir William Holcroft of the prosecution in 1687 of Anne Watts, a fortune-teller from London who had been sleeping rough in the woods of one of Holcroft's neighbours. In her possession were a number of books, no doubt the tools of her trade, among which there were said to be 2 works by the magician Cornelius Agrippa. One of these was probably the 1650 English translation of the 3 books of occult philosophy. The other was most likely the 1655 English translation by Robert Turner of the 4th book of occult philosophy, spuriously attributed to Agrippa. She also possessed a copy of one of John Gadbury's almanacs, and most importantly, a copy of Scott's The Discovery of Witchcraft, probably the 1665 edition, which she no doubt used for spells, tricks, and conjurations. Holcroft ordered all of these works burnt. It is ironic that Scott's book, reputedly burnt by King James I for its skeptical approach, was eventually burnt for its utility as a source book for magic. Again, not to, say that Philip hasn't done his research. He really has. But again, there's no evidence that Scott's book was burned by James I. But very definitely, Holcroft ordered Anne Watts's books to be committed to the flames. Condemned to Vulcan, if you will. Remember that? Okay, all good. Moving forward. One of the major ironies, of course, of Reginald Scott's The Discovery of Witchcraft is that we will never know how dissatisfied Scot was that his ideas were not taken up completely during his lifetime. We do know that some of the reception was certainly positive, but it didn't seem like it had the true impact that Scot would have certainly wanted. He was probably pretty disappointed at the outcome of all of his years of truly hard work and exhaustive research. His critique on how spirits interacted with the world, or in his estimation, how they didn't, but even if they were real, they just actually can't do very much, was one that would lie in direct contradiction, the exact opposite of the sorts of people that would utilize his book in a practical way. One wonders if any of the people that would have used the practical parts of Reginald Scott's work for ritual magic would perhaps have taken the time to read the rest of his work and in some way have been convinced by his arguments. Of that, we're just not going to know. That's another thing that we're just not going to know. Most likely, they would have been as skeptical of Scott's spiritual world as he would have been of theirs. It is indeed a bitter irony, but it also is the kind of irony that makes this work so tantalizingly brilliant for us nowadays. A book's story is never truly just its story. There's always, as I've mentioned, the story before the story, and there is always the story after the story. Each element of the work and its life truly is what makes it important. In the Western ritual magic continuum, I honestly can't think of a book one specific book authored by one specific person that we know by name, that we can point out and say they were responsible for this, well, nearly entirely, 1665, that has had as much of an impact as this work. No doubt it certainly helped shape people's perceptions on witchcraft and witchmongers, to use his word, and the kinds of evil that they get up to, the kinds of evil that we are capable of when we are truly scared of things and give too much agency to the invisible world. But it certainly also helped expand that invisible world and the world of magic as well. The Discovery of Witchcraft is an astounding document, one that needs to be met on its own terms, and it is fairly easy to be able to get the information and make it practical. There is truly nothing else like it, and it is, in my opinion, well worth your attention. Now, I know some of you might be like, well, you haven't really gone through the kinds of spells and stuff specifically in this episode. Well, one of the major reasons for that is that it's actually pretty easy to find the stuff. Scot does a pretty good job of indexing. They're basically all in the titles of the chapter headings within the book. And with your knowledge after having listened to this episode, you now know what is basically in each and every book in Reginald Scot's The Discovery of Witchcraft. I want to learn about augury. Cool. Book 11. Look there. Also, by the way, I hope you know about Roman numerals. Book 11, that's going to be XI. If you have that down, you're set. But yes, I don't have time to go through every single spell or even like some of the more interesting spells. There's a lot of stuff there. If you want to learn how to make holy water, it's in there. There's a chapter in there. It tells you how to do holy water. You can find it pretty easily. Book 12, chapter 10, I believe. All you need to do is just get your hands on a copy of this book. Pretty easy to look stuff up. You might be asking, well, how do I access this information? Well, lucky for you, I'm going to make everything very apparent and very easy for you to understand if you want to make the Discovery of Witchcraft a part of your life, or you're just interested in seeing what all the fuss is about. All right. The first thing to know is that it is available online for free. I'll have it in the show notes. You can read it in PDF form. You can also read it in EPUB form. Again, this was produced a long, long time ago, and so you'll definitely have access to it in that form. Now, should you go to my website, whatmagicisthis.com, you find this episode from the little menu that I have there. I want to make this clear. The file that I am linking you to read Scot's Discovery on Witchcraft on either your computer or your reading device, however you can even on your phone, whatever, that is going to be the 1665 third edition. In my opinion, that's my favorite edition. Now, some of you might be like, that's not enough. I want to read the Discovery of Witchcraft in my hand. I want to have a physical book copy of this book. I am here to warn you against getting the copy of this book that you can find that's put out by Dover. What Dover has done is, I'm not going to say it's a it's a disservice to the Discovery of Witchcraft in the sense that it is using a highly edited version. Not highly edited, is using an edited version of Scot's Discovery of Witchcraft, which was done by Montague Summers, who was an English author as well as a devout Catholic who had the kind of worldview that Reginald Scot would have been critical of, certainly, which is really quite unfortunate, as this edition put out by Dover is Montague Summers' 1930 edition of Reginald Scot's Discovery of Witchcraft, which is unfortunately also the most read version of Scot's Discovery of Witchcraft. Montague Summers pulls some really lame shit because in his introduction to his version of Reginald Scott's The Discovery of Witchcraft, he quotes an anonymous person who he has called a cautious and circumstantial investigator who has this to say about Reginald Scot personally. Scot was naturally skeptical, and in religion he would be nowadays a pseudo-scientific modernist. That is to say, he was utterly without imagination, a very dull, narrow, and ineffective little soul. Had he dared, Scot would have openly denied the supernatural. Of that there can be no doubt. It's pretty insulting, I would say. Who on earth could this anonymous investigator that Montague Summers quoted in the introduction to his version of The Discovery of Witchcraft? Oh, it was him. He did it. He called himself an anonymous person and he quoted himself. That is loser bullshit, Montague Summers. Everybody, go look up a picture of Montague Summers. Go to the Wikipedia page and look up Montague Summers. I'll wait. Go do it now. Pause this. Go do it now. Look him up. Now do you get it? Right? That's some loser bullshit right there. Being critical of somebody who's already long dead and then being like, this anonymous person has this to say about their character. And then that just ends up being you. That's some weak sauce, Montague. You know better than that. What exactly does Montague do with Reginald Scott's The Discovery of Witchcraft? He does not include the 1665 added material. He also takes out that entire discourse on devils and spirits that Scot put at the end of his book originally. And no doubt the fact that this is the most widely read edition leads people to try and understand that Reginald Scot was, a rational atheist, because the chapter or the part of the book that really explains the theology that Reginald Scot had, which is in the Discourse upon Devils and Spirits, Montague ripped that out. So most people think that, this guy is the champion of rational Enlightenment values, which Reginald Scot isn't and can't be. Sorry. Anyone that reads that discourse at the end would be like, oh man, this guy's got some interesting ideas about the Holy Spirit and other stuff. All of this is to say, do not buy the paperback version put out by Dover of Reginald Scott's The Discovery of Witchcraft at all. It's just not worth it. I mean, I understand it's nice to have a copy of Reginald Scott's The Discovery of Witchcraft. This isn't it. There is a version of The Discovery of Witchcraft that is put out by Blackletter Press. That is only the 1584. So what you were getting there is it's nice looking. The cover's nice. The lettering, the translation, from what I'm given to understand, is good. But it is just the 1584 first edition. It's just prettied up, made to look good. So it doesn't have that juicy 1665 content, unfortunately. And I don't know about you. That's the good stuff. There's some really good information even if it wasn't put in there even if it wasn't put in there by Reginald Scot. We don't know who put that information in there. You can get the 1665 material in book format, and that is from the second volume of the books that I mentioned earlier, those 3 books that I mentioned earlier by John Madziarchik. The Magicians Discovered excluded chapters from The Discovery of Witchcraft. Volume 2 is called The Core Texts. That's the 1665 material, as well as some other stuff that's in there. However, it is not the complete 1665 edition of Reginald Scott's The Discovery of Witchcraft. I am sorry to say that for me, you can't get the 1665 Discovery of Witchcraft in a physical paperback form to at least my satisfaction, at least in a form that I feel this book is worthy of having. The best way of getting that, unfortunately, is at this point only digitally. Again, the link for that is in the show notes. Sorry. Somebody someday, I'm sure, will put that 1665 edition and all of the nice juicy stuff in there out at some point. But as it stands right now, May of 2026, that doesn't exist. At least not in a good way. I'm sure that somebody will publish it through some self-published thing on Amazon, and it'll be like, it won't be good. Just for now, just I don't know, print yourself off a copy of the link that I will have in the show notes to this episode. But stay away. Stay away from that Dover edition, the Montague Summers 1930 version of the Discovery of Witchcraft. Unfortunately, I own it. I've got it. And when I bought it, I was like, where's all the good stuff? Where is all the juicy stuff? And then I eventually, because I bought it years ago, I'm like, where's all the cool things? And then I read up about what happened with Montague Summers, and it's like, what a bummer. You took out all the good bits. Well, I mean, there's some really good stuff, even without that stuff. But the juicy, really fantastic, crazy, magical spirit evocation, fairies, and all of that kind of thing, that's just not in there. And I love that stuff because it really sits apart from anything that came before it. And truly almost anything that came after it. As I said, it's part of the story of this work, an important element to the story of this work. There you have it. You're more than welcome to download the version that I have. It's through Project Gutenberg, so it's you can just click it and you've got it. I'm always shocked when I do certain episodes of my show that are in ways about certain individuals or individuals are in those episodes. And while this episode was not specifically about Reginald Scot, he's not a member of the Fools Gallery, although probably should be. What a fool. What did you think was going to happen? You literally thought that by putting highly detailed information about how to do rituals and spells in your book, that when people see that, they're going to be like, oh, this is really dumb. Did you really think that? Did you not think that they're going to be like, oh, this is wonderful. You've given me everything I need to use to become a ritual magician and to do these rituals? I'm pretty sure he was earnest, right? And that's maybe what could possibly be considered a fool, right? He was so sincere. He actually thought that by exposing these rituals and writing them down and these spells and these incantations and these enchantments, that people would look at this at the time. People at the time who believed in a spiritual world, they'd look at them and go like, oh yeah, that's dumb. That didn't happen. It didn't happen for another couple hundred years. So yeah, maybe, I'll say it here. Reginald Scot, honorary member of the Fools Gallery. Anyhow, when I do these episodes based around certain individuals, whether they are members of the Fools Gallery and did a full episode on specific individuals, or I'm talking about a specific work like I am here, I'm always shocked at how the people that I don't expect to identify or relate to, that I somehow end up identifying and relating to them in some regard. I truly respect the way that Reginald Scot really, at bottom, wanted to get as much information out there for people to be able to abstract their own way of thinking about these. He was providing a different perspective with a ton of detail that was pertaining particularly to the unseen, invisible, supernatural, magical world that existed at his time. And while he didn't really believe in it, at least not in the way that, I believe in the world, he was still really steadfast in providing the information. And in a way, this is going to sound egotistical, but that's kind of what I do with What Magic Is This podcast. It's one of the things that I've been hailed for, is my somewhat no-nonsense, blowing away the cobwebs of myths about the unseen, extraordinarily weird and wonderful world of magic and the occult. And while I try not to go into the most excruciating detail about very, very specific spells and things like that, the way that Reginald Scot does, at least not here, I sometimes do it on my Patreon, I truly get, in a way, I feel some kind of kinship, or at least an understanding with Reginald Scot as to why he wanted to do what he did. He wanted people to understand certain things that were seemingly inaccessible to them, things that to them would have seemed almost impossible to learn about, or just really required a ton of work to learn about them the correct way, in a way that was digestible and understandable. While the majority of the target of the people that he probably wanted to direct the book at were, for the most part, illiterate, he hoped that people that were literate and people that would be working with working class peoples and people of lower social standing that really were terrified and bewildered by the capacities of witches and what magic can accomplish. The exhaustive detail in which he was able to put this information down is highly commendable and, for me, highly relatable. All right, I've waxed my Corvette enough, but I hope people can understand what I'm trying to get at here. It's actually not the easiest to do this sort of thing, to be able to have some kind of necessary distance on a specific topic, to be able to provide as much information that allows for others to form their own opinions and see if the information itself is useful to them. At least for Reginald Scot, this was a somewhat nascent attitude that some people took. And Reginald just saw it as a way to inform people, but also to allow people to see the way that he sees the world. And while I don't completely agree with the way that Reginald sees the world as far as spirit interaction in the lives of humans and corporeal engagement with spirits and demons and angels and all sorts of things, I think that that is an essential part of understanding this book as a whole. And I hope that in some way I've been able to do the same with my show. I hope that my listeners would probably be able to inform other people, what what I think and how I see the world. I think, if somebody was to ask one of somebody who's listened to my show quite a bit, well, okay, that's an interesting podcast and it seems to have interesting topics on it, but what does this guy Doug actually believe? What does he think? That you'd be able to be like, well, he thinks that there's more alive things in the world than we think that there are. He seems to think that the universe itself is a living being, an actual organism, and that magic is, at bottom, the best way of interacting with this spirit-filled world. I just think that perhaps maybe I have less of an axe to grind than our friend Reginald did. As I try to do with each and every episode of this show, is to impart a major theme, perhaps the message of each topic that I tackle here on the show. And in this case, it's the same thing that I started out with. You have to ask yourself, do you have a way of remaining skeptical so much that you are not blind? And in addition to this, as an envoy of the unseen world, are you able to balance that with an open-mindedness to know and to see when true, real magic is in front of you and when it is being exhibited by figures that you might interact with either here in the real world or through cyberspace? Beyond the simple things like being able to recognize certain catchphrases that people bring up or topics, things like Lemuria or Lionsgate, Portal, easy enough red flags. Yet beyond this, are you able to see when people are using the language and the terms and the concepts you yourself have taken to heart and head, and realize when they are being misconstrued, misrepresented, and misaligned for purposes that are seemingly contrary to the concepts themselves? What's more, are you brave enough to step outside of something such as unverified personal gnosis and see that some people's revelations, be they real or fraudulent, could perhaps have been used as some kind of tool for deceit and misdirection? We have less witchmongers to deal with these days. We have something entirely different and yet entirely the same as when Reginald Scot was writing his book. Can you see the figures that are using this thing, this beautiful thing in which we see flourishing so beautifully around us, this reemergence of magic, and then detect those who use this beautiful thing to their advantage, for their power, for their finances, for their own purely selfish reasons. We are engaging with something that the rational, enlightened world is entirely skeptical of. Are you yourself brave enough to be a bastion of skepticism in this occult oasis that we find ourselves now? I think this might be easier for people to answer than it actually is. The solve, of course, is an easy one. It is one that Reginald Scot provided a template for in The Discovery of Witchcraft. What do you actually believe? Do you have the courage to take these beliefs and lay them bare to the world in your words, but especially your actions? Are you able to discover witchcraft? If you haven't guessed it, I love this thing. Books are a major reason that I do what I do, and I have a love for the Western ritual magic tradition. The story of this work and where it went and how it was made is such an exceptional thing, and I absolutely love it. I have used and exhausted all of my words in praise for this item. All I can say is that I really hope that you do the same and you engage in this on your own terms. And if you're aware of this and you've seen some of the spells in it and the rituals in it, but you haven't gone through any of the other parts of the Discovery of Witchcraft, rectify that, correct that. I guarantee you will find some interesting stuff in this book. However, if you want to learn a little bit more about this timeless classic, as I called it at the beginning of this show, best way of doing that, in my opinion right now, is that course that Dr. Alexander Cummins has on the Discovery of Witchcraft. There will be a link to that in the show notes for this episode. The other show notes I have for this show are really great. There's some fantastic essays. A lot of them are on JSTOR. People get intimidated by JSTOR. If you have an email account, you can read 100 articles for free every month. I've tried to exhaust that. I never have. So don't be intimidated by JSTOR. A lot of the fantastic essays that I've talked about on this episode are there, and they will be in the show notes to this show. Those show notes are available at whatmagicisthis.com. Go to the menu there, click on episodes, find the link to this show, The Discovery of Witchcraft, and have fun with those essays. They're great. They're fantastic. Do you want to know what else is fantastic? People that support my show and have this be my career, my job. That's right. This is all I do for a living. I am a full-time dad, and I am a full-time podcaster. Impressed? I know you are. All right. The last half an hour of this episode, I know it might sound like I'm being very egotistical. I'm actually not. I'm a very humble person. The humble person has to tell people that they're humble. Anyways, do you think that I'm doing something cool here on What Magic Is This podcast, and you would like to show your support in some way to allow me to continue to do this as my job? Well, there's four excellent ways of doing so. The first way is the absolute best way, and that is supporting me on Patreon. That is patreon.com/whatmagicisthis. What happens when you sign up? Well, first of all, it is only $7 a month. You're going to be like, wow, that's so cheap, Douglas. Why is it so cheap? It's because I want you to see the things that I have there. I think my best work is on the Patreon. And while you very well might enjoy this show that I do here, free, that's for everybody. If you support my work through Patreon, $7 a month, you get access to episodes about entities. You get to see how to start to interact with something like evocatory ritual magic or Solomonic magic. I have an episode where I go through what my favorite angel grimoires are. Full episodes on book recommendations. I just finished an episode on a book recommendation. The amount of awesome episodes that I have there on the Patreon, including videos that show you how to go do certain things like set up an ancestral altar, make your own Florida water, how to petition saints like Saint Expedite, etc., is available to you if you join my Patreon. It is the absolute best way of ensuring that I continue to do this as my job and as my career. There's close to 1,500 free supporters of my show on Patreon. If only a third of you decided to become a paying Patreon supporter, you will have changed my life forever. As it stands right now, I have about 345 paying supporters. I love every single one of them. They are the best people on earth, and they are getting the good stuff. So if you are a Patreon supporter, thank you so much. If you're considering becoming a Patreon supporter, please do it, because yes, this is what I do. This is my job, and I seriously need your support to continue to do it. So that is patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com and find any number of the support me on Patreon buttons there. They're everywhere. I put them everywhere because, again, it's my career. This is, I stopped having a job that was quite well paying to be able to do this, which is my dream. And I love that this is what I get to do. And I hope that that love is palpable to each and every one of you listening to this show. All right, what's the second best way of supporting me? Well, you can literally just give me a chunk of change through PayPal. If you head to whatmagicisthis.com, there are a bunch of PayPal links there. You just click them. There's 2 P's. Click them. Send me $5, $10, $20. If you're not into the whole paying every month thing like they do on Patreon, I understand. So any and every bit paid through the PayPal just go straight back into the show, because things cost money. I know I say this all the time. It's getting ridiculous. What this whole subscription model thing, I hate it. How did we get here? I have another thing that I have to pay. I think something like, I have to pay $178 every, I think it is like 6 months or something like that. It's a weird subscription model. Anyhow, there's another thing that I have to make sure that this show sounds as good as it does. It's another plugin for my editing software. This is, I think, the second episode that I've used it, so hopefully it sounds nice. Anyhow, having a podcast is expensive, so if you pay with PayPal, donate some money to me, just goes right back into this show and making it sound as sweet as it does. The third way of supporting me is an awesome way, because it also helps you. Do you love books? Do you love the Discovery of Witchcraft? Well, don't buy the Dover copy of Discovery of Witchcraft. It's not even in. I have an online bookshop that I run through bookshop.org, and I have a list of books that I have mentioned in my show. Pretty much almost every book that I mentioned and more is under each and every episode of What Magic Is This podcast at my bookshop, and you can buy it. The Dover copy of The Discovery of Witchcraft is not there because it's shit, but there's other stuff there, like Philip Allman's England's First Demonologist. Great book. If you buy that book, what happens is that an independent bookseller sells you that book. Bookshop.org gets a little cut of the amount of money you've paid for the book, and I get a little cut of money because I recommended it to you. Everybody wins. You get a book, the bookseller sells a book, the platform that is putting it up on the internet gets a little bit, and then you help me a little bit. It's fantastic. That is bookshop.org/shop/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com. Click on the bookshop links there. They're at the very bottom of the page. They're also in the menu. It is awesome. There's some really interesting books that I have there for this one, including a couple of books from Owen Davies, and again, that Philip Allman book. Going to say it once more. If I mentioned the book on the show or on any of the episodes, I have a link to it in my bookshop. So that's a fantastic way of getting yourself a book and helping me just a wee bit. The last way of supporting what I do is not the most financial support, but it is something that I love dearly seeing, and that is if you were to grab yourself some merchandise, coffee mugs, t-shirts, hoodies, tote bags, throw pillows, wall hangings. There's a ton of things that you can grab, some swag, and that is run through TeePublic. Head to whatmagicisthis.com, go to the menu, click on merchandise. You can find any number of these things. I just recently had some lovely Earl Grey tea, hot, and I drank it. That's a second Star Trek reference, this show. There you go. Tea, Earl Grey, hot. I know you all know what I'm talking about because you're a fucking nerd like me, and I love you. Anyhow, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, I just drank some Earl Grey tea out of a What Magic Is This mug that I have, and here's the thing. This is a secret. Earl Grey tea, hot, actually tastes better out of a What Magic Is This mug. It's scientific. Okay, it might not be scientific. Anyways, I have some really cool stuff in the merch store. I don't see a ton of money from it, but I absolutely love seeing people wearing t-shirts, drinking out of mugs, carrying a tote bag, all of these things. So if you do grab yourself some swag, please send me a picture. I'd love to see it. It's wild to me that people walk around wearing What Magic Is This t-shirts. And then if somebody asks you, what magic is this? You get to tell them it's a podcast. They just did a 2.5-hour podcast about a book called The Discovery of Witchcraft. And it's weird because discovery is spelt with an I-E as opposed to a Y. So it's Old English, and it's a weird one. Let me tell you all about it. You know what? Better yet, go listen to the episode. You lucky so-and-so. Anyways, it happens. It really does. All right. Anyhow, if you want to grab yourself some merchandise, head to whatmagicisthis.com. Find it in the menu there. But any and all of these things are well and duly appreciated because, again, they support what I do. But the best way of supporting me, the way that I'd like to see it, because I have some great stuff there, is through the Patreon. Once more, patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com and find the support me on Patreon buttons there. All right, that is all I have for every single one of you. Find this book. Read it. Don't just look through the spells. I have in the show notes to this episode, I know I keep talking about the show notes. In the show notes to this episode, if you're just interested in the magic, I've got a link to that. Go to the show notes for this show. It's there. Go look through my show notes and just click it. It's like if you don't have the time to read all of the other stuff, which I think you should read so you get to understand, something outside of your current understanding. This happens when you read, When you read books, big books, you're seeing into another world. It's crazy magical. Anyhow, I really hope that besides the magic that you actually engage in this work. It is, as I said at the beginning of this episode, probably one of the most important books to the Western magical tradition in any language. That is no mean feat. It is crazy how influential this book is. And again, we see its images and the words and the spells everywhere. And it's been like that since the mid-17th century. Massively influential, massively useful for practical magicians, and massively worth your attention. Go discover Reginald Scot's The Discovery of Witchcraft. You owe it to yourself. And you owe it to Reggie. You owe it to Reginald, right? I think he would have been happy that that we did the things that we're doing with his book. But I can seriously say to Reginald, if I was to do a little ritual thing and poof, there he appears. He's like, whoa, I didn't think that would work. And I was like, well, you might have to change that last little book of your book there, Reggie. But I just want you to know, thank you. I've actually read your entire book. I've read it from cover to cover. You're welcome, is what I would say. And he would probably say, are you a Catholic? No, who knows what he would say. All right, that's all I have for this episode. Reginald Scott's The Discovery of Witchcraft. I hope each and every one of you find this thing and involve it in your life in some way. All right, until next time, everybody, I want you all to stay healthy, to stay hopeful, and to stay luminous. Until next time, take care, everyone. Ta-ta. Bye-bye. Be well.